All right, we are almost done with chapter 7, next to the last lecture. Now we're talking about fermentation and anaerobic respiration. So at this point, we are talking about what happens, what do cells do when they don't have access to oxygen in the mitochondria? So let's think about when this might happen. So if you are exercising vigorously, you're still breathing, right, to bring in oxygen to your cells, but it may not be able to get to your muscle cells as quickly as your muscle cells need it under intense activity or intense stress. And so in those circumstances, your muscle cells still need ATP to be able to do their job, but they don't have oxygen available in the mitochondria to pull those electrons toward it. Remember that electron magnet that oxygen serves as. So what is left? What is available to your cells at that point? What is available is glycolysis. Okay, so glycolysis does not require the presence of oxygen in the mitochondria, which makes sense, right? Because we talked before about how glycolysis is common to all cells, prokaryotic and eukaryotic. Well, prokaryotic cells don't have a mitochondria. And so it makes sense then that glycolysis does not require oxygen to be present in the mitochondria. The sole purpose of fermentation and anaerobic respiration is to keep glycolysis open. Because remember, in glycolysis, even though we use up 2 ATPs per glucose, we also make a little bit of ATP. And that ATP is extremely critical under anaerobic or fermentation conditions. The other thing that's really important for to understand about fermentation and anaerobic respiration, is the necessity to maintain the cell's NAD+ supply. Okay, so we talked about the fact that NAD+ is an electron transport molecule, that it picks up electrons during redox reactions and takes them to the mitochondria to participate in the electron transport chain. But under anaerobic conditions, that doesn't happen. NADH can't go to the mitochondria and donate the electrons to the electron transport chain. So if we're not careful, we're going to have this huge buildup of NADH. Well, what's the problem with that? The problem with that is that NAD+ is an enzyme cofactor. Okay, the enzyme number 6 in glycolysis requires NAD+. If all of a cell's NAD+ supply has been converted into NADH and there's no NAD+ available, enzyme number 6 can't work. If enzyme number 6 can't work, what does that do to the rest of the glycolysis pathway? It shuts it down. If you remember from our glycolysis, the first 5 reactions are the energy investment phase, okay? We use up 2 ATP. We don't make any, we use them up. Reaction 6 is where NAD+ is required, but the ATP that is made in glycolysis isn't made until reaction 7 and reaction 10. So if enzyme number 6 does not have NAD plus available, then those reactions 7 through 10 shut down. What's left of glycolysis? Reactions 1 through 5, the reactions that use up ATP. Is that what we want for our cells during anaerobic conditions? Absolutely not. It is critical to the health of cells that this entire pathway stays open. The only way to do that is to make sure that we regenerate NAD+. Normally that's done in the electron transport chain, but we can't do that in the absence of oxygen. Okay, so there are a couple of different approaches that different cell types use for fermentation. Yeast undergo alcohol fermentation. Okay, so again, we've got glycolysis happening. Reaction number 6 reduces NAD plus to NADH. Well, there's got to be a way to regenerate that NAD plus. That happens when pyruvate, remember that's the final product of glycolysis, pyruvate is reduced to acetaldehyde, which is then converted into ethanol. NADH is oxidized back to NAD+. Okay, so this energy that NADH picked up through the reduction process in glycolysis isn't put into use in the electron transport chain. Instead, it's put into use reducing pyruvate into ethanol. Okay, well, the yeast don't need ethanol. They're not doing anything with it. It is a byproduct as far as they're concerned. But humans have certainly made good use of the fact that yeast make ethanol. The beer brewing industry depends on yeast. The baking industry depends on yeast. So, humans have certainly made use of that. Now, the yeast are limited to the percent of ethanol that can build up in their cells, and they can't survive much past like 12% or something. So, yeast fermentation is not used to make hard liquor, but some of the beers and wines and things can depend on yeast fermentation. So again, the whole point of fermentation is to oxidize NADH back into NAD plus so that NAD plus can do its job in reaction 6 of glycolysis, so that glycolysis stays open so that a little bit of ATP can be made in reaction 7 and reaction 10. Okay, so that's how yeast do fermentation. Animal cells do fermentation a little bit differently via lactic acid. So the same kind of thing is going on, right? Glycolysis is happening. Pyruvate is the final product of glycolysis. In reaction 6, NAD plus is reduced to NADH. Well, at the end of glycolysis, pyruvate is going to be reduced into lactic acid. So the energy that is in NADH from the electrons that it picked up are going to be put into reducing pyruvate into lactic acid, and NADH is oxidized back into NAD+. Well, for humans, again, lactic acid is a byproduct. It doesn't actually do us any good. The only purpose in creating lactic acid, again, is to maintain the NAD plus supply to keep glycolysis open. Now, we used to think that lactic acid buildup in muscle cells was responsible for the muscle soreness and stuff that you get after you exercise hard or whatever. But we now know that lactic acid is actually cleared from the muscle cells really quickly, like within a few hours. And so it's not responsible for the soreness that we feel after we exercise. Exercise physiologists are now thinking that it may be some small trauma to the muscle fibers themselves, the protein fibers that make up muscle cells, and that the immune response, the inflammation and stuff is a result of the immune response to the trauma of those muscle cells. Okay, but again, the purpose of fermentation is to maintain the NAD plus supply so that glycolysis can stay open. Because if NAD plus isn't available, the enzyme that does reaction 6 of glycolysis cannot do its job. If enzyme 6 can't work, reaction 7 through 10 can't happen. And reactions 7 through 10 are where we get the ATP in glycolysis. Again, why is that important? Because under anaerobic conditions, everything after glycolysis shuts down. Okay, so pyruvate is made, but it cannot enter the mitochondria. Okay, so the only ATP supply under anaerobic conditions is from reactions 7 through 10 of glycolysis. Now, in animal cells, some cells, like your muscle cells, can undergo anaerobic respiration for short periods of time, not prolonged periods of time. The brain, however, cannot do anaerobic respiration or fermentation. It can only do aerobic respiration, which is why when your brain is deprived of oxygen for more than a few minutes, there can be serious irreversible damage that takes place. Okay, so again, different cell types within multicellular organisms have different abilities. Muscle cells can do fermentation for short periods of time. The brain can't do it at all.